Hello, today we're going to be doing a webinar on the politics of child abuse. My name's Felicity Lee. I'm the owner of IGDID.com, an online community for child abuse survivors. I'm also a survivor of child abuse. I hold degrees in psychology, English with an emphasis on writing, and a Master's of Arts degree. I'm a certified teacher, now retired. I taught mostly middle school special education, English, language arts, and science. I enjoy writing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. I love to do crafts, and I have two grown boys. Today, I have with me David Shurter. Would you like to introduce yourself, David?
Thank you, Felicity. I am author of Rabbit Hole, a satanic ritual abuse survivor story. It details my father's activity as a child abductor, and I have been a survivor all of my life, but have been out and helping survivors for the last 7 years. I'm an artist, and I live a quiet life with my soulmate and 2 dogs in the Midwest. And one last thing, I have a website, www.davidshurter, that's S-H-U-R-T as in Tom, E-R.com. Thanks, Felicity.
Thank you, David. Today, here's an introduction of what we'll be talking about today. We'll present a timeline beginning with the first major child protective law, CAPTA, and the events concerning child abuse up until now. We're going to tell you what CAPTA is, and with any new law comes an opposition to the law. The opposition became known to child abuse advocates as the Backlash. We're going to talk about how the backlash affected our society's reaction as well as its ability to protect children by enforcing CAPTA. We're going to talk about who the backlash is and how they operate. We're also going to talk about how the backlash and their operation has affected child abuse today. A lot of the things that we'll be presenting is just quotes and a lot of reading. So if David would help me read through things, that'd be nice.
Sure.
Okay. Let's start with the problem. Today, we're all becoming acutely aware of child abuse and exploitation that has been happening right under our nose worldwide as well as in the United States. Our society is responsible for listening to, protecting, and supporting our children and survivors of child abuse. Laws have been enacted to ensure that the funds are available and adults have been given the authority to report suspected cases of child abuse. The backlash that began in the early 90s continues to thwart our society's ability to protect the abused, to support the survivors of child abuse, and put away the perpetrators. In fact, the backlash has provided a new source of revenue for false memory advocate attorneys, suing therapists and doctors under false pretenses, presenting evidence that has never been accepted by the scientific community. This has effectively scared many therapists from even treating survivors of child abuse, further silencing them and thus keeping child abuse active and unchecked. Let's go back to the beginning with the CAPTA. In 1974, Congress enacted the very first major federal legislation addressing child abuse and neglect in exchange for federal funding for child abuse prevention and treatment. It's the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or CAPTA. CAPTA provides federal funding to states in support of prevention, assessment, investigation, prosecution, and treatment activities, and also provides grants to public agencies and nonprofit organizations for demonstration programs and projects. Additionally, CAPTA identifies the federal role in supporting research, evaluation, technical assistance, and data collection activities, establishes the Office on Child Abuse and Neglect, and mandates the National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Neglect information. CAPTA also sets forth a minimum definition of child abuse and neglect. Let's go back to a bit of history. Discussion of how to enforce the new laws were not without problems and controversy, but until the early 1990s, the discussion remained focused on preserving the well-being of the family while also bringing criminals fairly to justice. In 1991, a new, but what society would come to realize to be one of the biggest scams in our history, the Backlash, a movement opposing the child protective laws, in order to defend accused child abusers and predators was making a public appearance. One of the most active and influential groups was the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, or the FMSF. Catherine Hine states, "It is common and usual for any reform movement after it achieves a certain measure of public support and sympathy, as did child protection during the 1970s and 80s, to be subjected to an oppositional movement. In the context of child protection, that oppositional movement has come to be known to child advocates as the Backlash." In 1991, the year before the formation of the FMSF, more than 80% of news coverage in the popular press about child sexual abuse was weighted toward histories of survivors and the nature of child abuse trauma. By 1994, more than 80% of news focus was on false accusation and the newly coined concept, false memory syndrome. Okay, we're going to move to mandatory reporters now. One of the most important requirements of the CAPTA laws was requiring mandatory reporting. While the law left states latitude as to who would be required to report, the state had to mandate reporting, usually at least for professionals such as teachers, doctors, and mental health workers. Some states make all citizens mandatory reporters. Mandated reporting is coupled with the threat of prosecution if one fails to report a suspicion. And now we're going to move to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. It's interesting that these mandatory reporters were affected by their ability to report by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, making it easier for child abuse to continue. David, do you want to read about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation?
Sure. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was established in 1992 as an advocacy organization for people claiming to be falsely accused of sexual abuse. The foundation was formed primarily through the efforts of Peter and Pamela Freud, step-siblings and husband and wife, after they became aware that their adult daughter had disclosed to her husband that her father had sexually abused her as a child. Their daughter, professional Jennifer Freud, is a respected professor of psychology who has since written extensively on the impact of child abuse on memory. Assisting the Freuds was Dr. Ralph Underwager, a minister-turned-therapist who had testified for the defense in over 200 child abuse cases, including the Mr. Bubbles ritual abuse case in Sydney. He had previously established victims of child abuse laws to advocate for people whose children were removed from them by child protection services for child abuse. Underwager would step down from the board of the foundation in 1993 after giving an interview which he stated that pedophilia was blessed by God. That is a Patica. The magazine was Patica, by the way. With the assistance of Underwager and others, the FMSF established an advisory board with a number of prominent academics who began to promulgate the notion of false memory syndrome through the academic and popular press. The foundation defined FMSF as a social phenomenon of epidemic proportions, in which misguided therapists cause patients to invent memories of sexual abuse. This is from the Liz Library Organization, just to let people know. Okay. Do you want me to keep going, Felicity?
Okay, I can go ahead and do this part.
Okay.
There have been a number of problems, a number of concerns about the activities of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The foundation's founders and members diagnose thousands of people with FMSF without actually ever meeting them. The FMSF confabulates figures to create an epidemic of FMS for which there is no epidemiological evidence. The foundation accepts all denials of sexual abuse as true without asking for evidence, whilst stating that memories of sexual abuse are likely to be false unless there is evidence. The foundation founders and members have engaged in campaigns of harassment, defamation, and intimidation against adults complaining of sexual abuse and the professionals who provide them with care. The foundation's founders and members have regularly threatened legal actions to silence their critics and have a history of unsuccessful court actions against others for defamation. the Foundation's founders and members have deliberately misrepresented cases of sexual abuse in order to further their personal and political goals. The board members of the Foundation make a considerable amount of money as expert witnesses as part of the defense teams for people accused of sexual abuse and other crimes. The FMSF's financial success was dependent on having within its membership highly qualified professionals in their field, open access to the media, and a public who didn't want to believe the statistics and brutality of child abuse that was claiming our children and ripping apart the lives of survivors of child abuse. Although the FMSF began solely because of an accusation of child abuse within the founder's family, I personally do not believe that they knew that the ridiculous and unproved theory of false memory syndrome, which has never been a real syndrome, would have raked in the money for them that it did. Despite that no one could prove such a thing, the FMSF sent their loyal members out to begin suing therapists for implanting these false memories into clients' brains. And they were winning lawsuits one after the other, even going so far as to use their own plants to set up their therapists. Though the FMSF is not active right now, as far as we can tell, because of negative public opinion, I believe the Backlash is alive and well, continuing their crusade to protect and defend accused abusers, perpetrators of child abuse. There were many influential people who are a part of the Backlash. We'll just take a look at a few. R. Christopher Barton.
Before we start, Felicity, I wanted to say something about that last. I want to explain plants. If you are a therapist, what they will do is that they will send in a specific person who is designed to do nothing but find dirt on you and cause problems for you, and then they want to be treated as therapists. The problem with this is that when you have someone who comes in and says, I have memories of sexual abuse and all of these memories that are going on, as a therapist, you really can't say, no, that didn't happen. I mean, what kind of therapist would tell a client that? And so they're setting these therapists up and making a lot of money in the process. Sorry, I just wanted to just reiterate that.
Yes, and then what they'll do is the person who's planted there will go ahead and meet up with one of these attorneys, and the attorney will sue the therapist for implanting memories, that sort of thing. And then they'll end up in a court trial where the plant is actually suing the therapist, if that makes sense. So they win the case because the plant, is, and a lot of times, it's hard to prove that that the person actually was a plant. So.
Yeah.
And a good part of that is to scare the other therapists. So they'll make sure that it's all over the news, that this therapist is being sued, that they implanted memories, and then of course the media, the public reads that, they won and comes to believe that there is a such thing as implanting memories or having false repressed memories. So it gets complicated. It's been 30 years of doing this, so we have 30 years of this sort of thing happening, right?
Changing laws, changing public perception, changing how whistleblowers and people who can come forward to protect children can do their job or not do their job. I also want to say that therapists are not the only ones who have been attacked. Social workers and teachers are now the newest target for the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Anyone who comes forward with abuse of children is liable to have this group fall down on them to try and shut them up.
Right. So let's see. Okay, our Christopher Barton is a very influential person and a big part of the Backlash now and has been for a long time. So this, what I'm going to read now, is right off of his website. And he makes it sound like all of these things that he has on his website are good things because the public, as he thinks, has come to believe that what he says is good. So let's read it and take a look at it from another point of view. He is a national expert in psychology and law. Dr. Barton is a licensed psychologist, clinical and forensic, licensed attorney, research scientist, speaker, writer, and national science litigation legislation consultant. He was published in the learning journals in child psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology, psychiatry, and law. Dr. Barton helped draft and enact successful national health care legislation. Dr. Barton has been interviewed regarding complex science and legal issues by the U.S. Congressional Quarterly, CBS 60 News, ABC Nightline, and CBS Evening News, Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, U.S. News and World Report Magazine, Insight Magazine, The New Yorker, the LA Times, the New York Times, and Chicago Tribune, the London BBC, U.S. National Public Radio, ABC News, 2020, National German Television, National Finnish Television, 60 Minutes Australia, Canadian Public Radio, PBS Frontline, NBC Dateline, and many other media sources. This is to show you how much they get into the media. Okay, following successful efforts to reform the emergency medical system for children, Dr. Barton began systematic efforts to reform the mental health system using a five-prong approach of education, regulation, litigation, legislation, and prosecution. Dr. Barton focused on eliminating dangerous pseudoscientific notions such as recovered memory therapy, multiple personality disorder. Thanks to the collaboration, multidisciplinary effort of scientists, concerned families, mental health practitioners, and attorneys, after 10 years of successful civil litigation, legislative hearings, prosecutions, and licensing actions, these dangerous junk science methods of procedures have been greatly reduced or eradicated across the United States. Dr. Barton's current projects include reform efforts in the family law, mental health licensing, public education, and criminal justice systems. This was written very recently. The junk science he's talking about is the accepted method of treating
Junk science, in my opinion, is something that is not in the DSM, has never been in the DSM. You can't get disability for it because the government doesn't recognize it, and there's no way to get the insurance to pay for it because the insurance doesn't pay for it. False memory syndrome is not a syndrome, and nobody recognizes it. It is only used to basically support and protect pedophiles by saying that memories of sexual abuse don't exist or are false. But I just wanted to point out the thing that neither the DSM, nobody, as far as junk science goes, the False Memory Foundation and the false memory theories that they have presented are nothing but junk science. There is no scientific, factual proof that they can show specifically that this even exists. That's why they focus so much on the public and the media, because what they're trying to do is change opinion and media or public perception, because they don't have anything else to change everything by. Sorry, Felicity, go ahead.
I totally agree. Christopher Barton was also a member of the FMSF, an active advocate against child protective laws, represented many child abusers, predators, and was responsible for much of the harassment and lawsuits which terrorized mandatory reporters and mental health practitioners. Right now, let's move into another person who is influential to the backlash, Elizabeth Loftus. She once wrote, The most horrifying idea is that what we believe with all our hearts is not necessarily the truth. Well, she had that right on. Elizabeth Loftus has appeared on countless talk shows, including the Oprah Winfrey Show. She has published 19 books and nearly 200 articles. She remains one of the most sought-after psychology speakers and is an important spokesperson for the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The majority of Loftus' research focuses on repressed sexual abuse memories from childhood that suddenly reappear in adult women, often 20 years or more after the events took place. Her work raises enormous doubt about the validity of long-buried memories of trauma. She investigates the circumstances under which information received subsequent to an accident or crime may cause predictable changes in witness recollections of the event. Loftus' criticism of repression has altered the cornerstones of psychoanalysis and gives new rise to a number of questions. How common is it for memories of child abuse to be repressed? How are jurors and judges likely reacting to these repressed memories claims? When the memories resurface, what are they like? How authentic are the memories? Okay, Elizabeth Loftus has a long history of problems, which we won't go into today, maybe at another time. But she's now at the University of California, no longer at the University of Washington, where she got in a little trouble. I took this from the University of California, and it says, University of California research profile states that Elizabeth Loftus is an expert on nothing. Specifically, she studies events that never happened and evidence that never existed, yet somehow has etched a vivid memory. Loftus, distinguished professor of social ecology and professor of law and cognitive science at the University of California, Irvine, has shown since the early 1970s how people can be coaxed through suggestion into altering their own memories, often unintentionally by police questioning. By her estimate, Loftus has testified in more than 250 often contentious legal cases and consulted on many others, including Ted Bundy, Martha Stewart, O.J. Simpson, Michael Jackson, Oliver North, Lewis Libby, and the Oklahoma City bombing. She also led the way in debunking so-called repressed memories of sexual abuse. She also studied whether false memories can have positive impact. In December 1995, 2 women filed ethics complaint with the American Psychological Association against Elizabeth Loftus, PhD, regarding her public statements about 2 legal cases involving delayed memories of sexual abuse. Jennifer Holt, a concert harpist living in New York, and Lynn Crook, a Washington state consultant, each filed separate complaints with the APA alleging that Loftus mischaracterized the facts of their legal cases in published articles. Both women brought successful civil suits against the sexual abuse that their fathers and mother, in Crook's case, perpetrated against them during their childhoods. At their trials, they represented corroborative evidence that met the requirements for judicial proof of their allegations. Loftus serves on the Scientific and Professional Advisory Board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. She also had been an active member of the APA since 1973, but resigned in January 1996, shortly after the complaints were filed. Now, how can this happen, that these people have been effective in lawsuits, getting this information into the public that is false information? Well, Christopher Barton and Elizabeth Loftus are example of many involved in Backlash, but as the name implies, those representing the False Memory Syndrome Foundation conducted most of their research and finding based on the idea that the victims and survivors of abuse recollections of their own memories was either false or implanted by their therapists. Were these influential experts looking for fame, money to protect the perpetrators? This is difficult to determine. The important question is, how could testimony based on such ridiculous theories be allowed in court? Well,
I wanted to say, wait a minute, Felicity. Before we get into this, I wanted to explain to people that you have to understand that the False Memory Foundation was designed in 1992. It was designed after our nation experienced satanic ritual abuse allegations throughout the nation, some of which, perfect example would be the McMartin case, the Presidio daycare case, things that happened here in Omaha. All of these were coming out. And so what the False Memory Foundation was trying to do was not attack memories of that were false, but they were attacking things that just had happened. The False Memory Foundation termed the time that we were having problems with these allegations satanic panic. But as a very good friend of mine says all the time, the only people who were panicking during satanic panic were the abusers of children. And that is personally my opinion on why the False Memory Foundation was designed. Go ahead. Sorry, I just had to jump in and say that.
yes, that makes sense. Okay, this was all happening during this time, and it sounds like nobody came in. There was nobody out there protecting children. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation they had so much media that it feels like there weren't people out there, fighting them. There were. In fact, in 1998, Dr. Ann Salter, a renowned clinical psychologist, received a grant from the New England Commissioners of Child Welfare Agencies to study the research methods and conclusion of often quoted apparent backlash psychologist Ralph Underweger and Holida Wakefield. When Salter published her trustees' Accuracy of Expert Testimony in Child Sexual Abuse Cases about Underweger and Wakefield's scientific methods or lack thereof, Salter made very specific and detailed findings indicating that Underweger and Wakefield cite research that simply does not say what they say it does, maintain positions as factual when there is no research evidence to substantiate their claims, simply ignore contrary evidence, make numerous logical errors, and use citations that are so filled with errors it is difficult to find many of them. Worse, she found that the inaccuracies were uniformly in the service of strengthening Underweger and Wakefield's case against children who report sexual abuse. So she did put together a report, and that's what she found. But they were allowed to go ahead and present their cases as they were false. So we can see there are experts who are realizing that the backlash were beginning to perpetrate the scam that has now not only brought the child abuse statistics to staggering numbers, but also left child abuse survivors isolated with little to no support. How did they manage that? They weren't just protecting and defending child abusers and perpetrators, they were silencing the mandatory reporters and tying the hands of therapists whose job was to provide therapy for survivors of child abuse. Most importantly, they were silencing the survivors from being believed, and thus protecting the abusers, perpetrators from discovery. So these people were having a big influence on society. Here's some history that Katherine Hine presented. Do
you want me to read this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. By the late 80s and early 90s, attack upon mental health professionals began. The identified abusers of adult victims of child abuse began to avail themselves to a new third-party liability theories which they had based litigation against their adult children's therapists. Bowman and Mertz, 1996, described with alarm the recent emergence of these increasingly novel legal theories formulated specifically for use in lawsuits in civil court, seeking damages against therapists treating adult child sexual abuse survivors, patients who are, for the most part, satisfied with the targeted therapist. In other words, these people were going after therapists, but the client who they supposedly were representing was very happy with their therapist. They were getting help from their therapist. And still the False Memory Foundation decided to go after those therapists to silence them. The intensity of the attack on mental health professionals escalated in 1997 with the bringing of federal indictments against Houston mental health professionals Judy Peterson, Ph.D., Richard Seward, M.D., Gloria Kurga, M.D., Sylvia Davis, MSW, and hospital administrator George Jerry Muick, CPA. The defendants faced possible sentences of life imprisonment without parole, apparently because the government disagreed with the diagnosis and treatment of 7 children who claimed to have been falsely convinced that they had been victims of childhood abuse. A mistrial was declared in February 1999 after the dismissals of all but 11 jury members. The results of an informal jury poll showed that despite the fact that defense had not yet presented its case, the jurors were strongly inclined towards acquittal. On March 1, 1999, the government dismissed all charges against the 5 defendants. However, the legal costs of the defendants and the governments were staggering. Now, see, that's the whole thing. That's the key to this, is that they don't win these huge lawsuits that they try to do all the time. What they do is that they make it so public and make it so hard for the therapist or for the whistleblower to come forth and give information about child sexual abuse that they run out all of their resources, they take up all of their time, they destroy their professional reputations, they do everything that they possibly can to publicly destroy these people, to silence them. And what ends up happening is that the people who have been sexually abused, such as myself, and I'll just speak for myself, it makes one question whether or not they're strong enough to go after such a group. And it quiets not only the whistleblowers and the people who come in our defense, but it quiets us because we have been taught to be quiet, that no one will believe us and all of that. And the False Memory Foundation has done everything they can to support, and not only support, but reinforce this very statement, that no one will help us and that no one will believe us. Go ahead, Felicity. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Right, and what this case did is, it still sends terror through every therapist. Every therapist knows about this case, and they're scared that the same thing might happen to them. So in my experience, a lot of therapists don't treat people who are survivors of child abuse. If they know that there's any type of child abuse in their past, they'll move on. And so it keeps survivors of child abuse from getting the good care they need. So, okay, we went through this really quickly. I understand that. We'll have some discussion in a minute. I just want to go to the statistics of what we have today after we've been through 30 years of history with the backlash, influencing people's ideas, their opinions, their thoughts, and it's left us with a problem. According to the World Health Organization, up to 53,000 children are murdered worldwide each year. In 2002, the WHO estimated that 150 million girls and 73 million boys under 18 experienced some form of forced sexual intercourse. 1.8 million are involved in prostitution or pornography, and 1.2 million have been trafficked. Missing kids. 797,500 children younger than 18 were reported missing in a one-year period of time in America, resulting in an average of 2,185 children being reported missing each day. This number does not include throwaway kids who leave home unreported, the undocumented poor, nor does it include parents who sell their children, all of which are contributing factors to the ever-growing problem of child sex trafficking exploitation. The implications of child trafficking. Human trafficking has surpassed the illegal sales of arms. Trafficking will surpass the illegal sale of drugs in the next few years. Drugs are used once and they are gone. Victims of child trafficking can be used and abused over and over. A $32 billion a year industry, human trafficking is on the rise and is in all 50 states. 4 to 5 million of the trafficked persons are sexually exploited. Up to 300,000 Americans under 18 are lured into the commercial sex trade every year. From 14,500 to 17,500 of those victims are trafficked into the United States each year. Average victims' age is 11 to 14. Approximately 80% are women and children bought, sold, and imprisoned in the underground sex service industry. Average lifespan of a victim is 3 to 7 years, found dead from attack, abuse, HIV, other STDs, malnutrition, overdose, or suicide.
And now you're starting to see, wait a minute, Felicity. Now you're starting to see with those statistics how brutally dishonest the False Memory Foundation has been and how much damage it has done when you consider that a survivor only lives 3 to 7 years. How many survivors that actually have survived this, such as myself, that were in need of good therapists? I was lucky enough to find a great therapist. But how many of them have been silent? How many therapists have been silenced and are not out there for children who have actually gotten through this? Go ahead. I'm on my soapbox today.
Well, and I think back to Christopher Barton and what he wrote about what he's on his way to doing now, which is changing laws to make it harder for therapists to treat clients, which is, creating more public information on repressed memories being false, therapists implanting memories. All of this, if you think about all of the people who actually have, therapists, good therapists, this stops them from, and also the courts. All of these protections we have for child abuse and putting away the child abuser and the perpetrators have been thwarted, so that these people that are doing this stuff now have never been put away. I mean, juries have come in and listened to their ridiculous theories. They've heard it on the news. Christopher Barton, how many shows was he on? Like 30 shows. Elizabeth Loftus, 200 trials where she went on and, talked about false repressed memories. Then we have people in therapy, they're telling their therapists about their memories, and within their memories are people who broke the law. They're perpetrators, they're abusers, and they're stopped. So these people have continued to go on unchecked, and I think that's one reason that the numbers are so high. So, and saying, even the children that go into their therapist and report abuse are considered, kind of like liars. So they can't put away these people. So they've gotten so high that now the public doesn't know what to do. So the only answer is to stop listening to these people, take it case by case, and stop people like Christopher Barton from continuing on to make it more difficult for the mandatory reporters and therapists to listen to the survivors. And you know that because you know who your perpetrators were.
I know who my perpetrators were. Most people, it has been my experience, it was my personal experience that I had all of the issues that I had before I went to go see a therapist. I told my therapist exactly what was going on, and to be quite honest, I believe she was a bit nervous at the beginning. But anyone who knows me knows that no one, exactly other than proving that with laser beams and mice, how does one implant a memory into one? It's just, if I tried to convince you that you were once a pink unicorn with a purple parasol, what would you say? Any normal person would laugh at that and try to get away from me as soon as possible. And that's what we have with the False Memory Foundation, is that they are saying their basic contention is that pedophilia is not at the numbers that we are starting to see it at the pandemic levels that we are. You know, you only have to watch NBC's To Catch a Pedophile or To Catch a Predator to find out that sex abuse with children is happening on a huge level, and it needs to be dealt with, and we're not dealing with it because people are afraid to report it, because they're afraid that people like Christopher Barton will walk in and try and take everything away from them to silence them.
Well, people are worried about their own professions. I mean, that's their life, and it's a big threat to their life and their livelihood to be taken to court and sued, which is happening right now in a case called the Castlewood case, where there's a very good therapist who's being sued, just as these people were being sued back in '93. It hasn't stopped, and the public just has to see how it's allowing child abuse and predators to go free to be able to do what they like, because nobody wants their whole livelihood taken away because of some lawsuit accusing them of doing something like implanting repressed memories. I believe the Castlewood case supposedly is reporting that the therapist implanted memories of eating babies and ridiculous things like that. This effectively stops also the therapist from believing the client because, I mean, maybe these repressed memories are false. But instead of realizing that maybe these memories are true, and if they are, we have a chance. You know, I mean, case by case, the public should allow everybody to do their thing. The therapists have a job to do, the teachers have a job to do, everybody has their job to do, and they should all of their jobs should be based on and focused on protecting children and the survivors of child abuse. They should not be focused on whether the backlash is true or not. That has nothing to do with child abuse. Huh?
Or to come sue them. They should be able to, excuse me, they should be able to report the abuse and not have to worry that they're going to end up spending years in a lawsuit for doing their jobs. Simply doing their jobs. The other thing that I will say about the Castlewood case is that I was involved in satanic ritual abuse as a child. And I will tell you that neither I nor my older siblings, all of which remembered what had happened to us, remember eating one baby. No babies. No babies were eaten. No babies were murdered. It was children that we were experiencing. That was the abuse that was going on, was children. And the false memory people will say that we are looking for a witch hunt. We're not looking for witches. We're looking for pedophiles. Violent, vicious, unrepentant pedophiles. And so when we start to go look at the False Memory Foundation, instead of focusing on the therapist and coming to the conclusion that the child or the person that is recalling the abuse is lying, maybe we should take a moment to look at what they're saying, look at the validity of their complaints, and realize that people are starting to complain about abuse on massive levels, and we are at, again, a pandemic of child abuse. And so something has to be happening. It can't all be all of this human trafficking and false memory and all of that. It can't all be true all the while we're seeing this pandemic of children being molested and kidnapped. And when you consider that 2,185 kids are reported missing daily, and yet we listen to Casey Anthony and that whole thing on CNN for a year and a half? So while in a year and a half, over 800,000 kids were reported missing. But we're focused on one for a year and a half. That's a difficulty. This is a problem. This is all connected. Sorry, Felicity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what the public has to really, really look at and ask themselves is why are these, we'll call them the backlash people, because there's a lot of them, not just these few that I've talked to, but all of them, and their focus, every single one of them, is always on protecting the abuser, the perpetrator, always. That is their job, to protect the abuser and the perpetrator. Somebody has to ask, why is that a good thing when the people out there like the ISSTD, many other organizations are fighting tooth and nail to protect the children and the survivors of child abuse? And who has the money to get all of this out in the public? The Backlash has the money because they've sued so many people. And they are out there not doing their job to protect children or survivors of child abuse. It's the people who don't have the money, and there's more than that, more of them probably. They just don't have the funds to go out there and become public profiles. They're working behind the scenes as hard as they can to protect the children and the survivors. You know, they're the ones that are doing real research, but they don't have the money to get the research out there to the public. So,
and the reason why the False Memory Foundation is so lucrative on this is that they are fraudulently sending people in to set these organizations up. That's the reason why you see one person walk in and then convince 3 other people that the same thing is going on, and then you suddenly have 4 people out of how many years of Castlewood's history? You see what I'm saying? They're setting people up. They are fraudulently setting up lawsuits and getting money in a way that there has to be some provisions that are put in place to keep this from happening. Because the fact that this is legal is beyond me. I don't see how this could possibly be legal.
Well, it's the way the court system's set up. What stops them is public opinion. And they are very good at, they've had 30 years to sway public opinion their way. It's the jury has to go in and be able to look at it and say, just because this guy has a bunch of credentials, you know, he has a bunch of money and he's got all this power, it doesn't mean he's right. What the attorneys are saying,
or honest, or ethical, or any of that. Just because you have a lot of degrees and titles behind your name and all of that does not make you an ethical or an honest or a decent human being. It just means that you're educated. And there's nothing like going up against someone who's an educated idiot. Sorry, Felicity.
Okay, well, I think we're about done anyhow. Soon after
1974, when CAPTA was initiated, child abuse reports skyrocketed. An exerted effort by the Backlash to protect and defend abusers and remove therapists, mandatory reporters, and teachers and any other groups who advocated for children, as well as to sway public opinion, was also initiated. So all of this has been initiated. Other implications, the child exploitation trafficking business has been estimated at a $32 billion a year industry. This does not include only those who directly profit from such activities, but also benefits those in the legal system in the ways of attorneys who defend abusers, expert witnesses such as doctors, law officials, attorneys, etc., and especially the False Memory Foundation, who work at discrediting the victim and presenting the therapist, teacher, or reporting agency as incompetent in order to sway public opinion. Such concerted effort has had an effect on such things as jury pools, who have been swayed in defending perpetrators by media manipulation, who many times in the past have hailed the accused and incarcerated or sued the whistleblowers, who are either the victims of the abuse or their advocates. Good example of that is Alicia Owen with the whole Franklin credit scandal in Omaha, Nebraska. Alicia Owen came forth and said that she was a victim of sexual abuse with our then at one point in time police chief, And instead of going after and doing anything to the police chief, they incarcerated Alicia Owen and put her in jail and kept her in solitary for as much as any prisoner could possibly have. I think she's been in there the most. She's out now, though, and trying to live her life. Who are the victims? That's a good question. The answer to this question should be obvious. We all become victims with this eventually. The victims are the children, teens, and adults who continue to be abused, and the public whose children and resources are being exploited. Less obvious are the shrouded victims, those whose job it is to report, but whose hands are tied with threats of lawsuits, who are unable to protect our children. The False Memory Foundation members have helped to create a society that is blinded by misinformation the Backlash have propagated. The professionals have been swayed by threats to their careers and personal well-beings, which have been systematically carried out in the court systems and in their personal lives. Survivors have been re-traumatized and silenced when hearing of their harassment of others who have been reported the same threats that kept them silent as children in the first place, and professionals who have been made to conform to the practices initiated by the Backlash to protect and defend abusers. Those whose financial success is dependent on the continuance of child abuse and exploitation. In the end, we all become victims of this. We pay the cost of looking away. And we just can't do that. The conclusion, right now we're having some technical difficulties, so why don't I end this? We'll do the conclusion. Number one, there is a concerted effort to protect child abusers, which is the reason why we have the issues with child trafficking and exploitation that we do. Number two, the Backlash has reversed laws regarding the protection of victims, and legislation has been implemented to protect the abusers of children. Number three, our nation's problems with child trafficking has grown exponentially until we now have an estimated $36 billion a year problem with the exploitation of children. Number four, advocates of children and survivors of child abuse have been intimidated, arrested, charged, and tried, threatened with life imprisonment, stalked, and overall threatened by the Backlash. Number five, the media has been used to convince the public that their theories of false memory syndrome, a non-existent condition, is scientifically proven in order to protect child abusers and perpetrators, when this is not the case. Number six, and the final conclusion. Until we start to realize that abuse is generally understated rather than over-reported, our children will continue to be used in systematic and deplorable ways. It is going to take all of us to change the system of abuse that has been implemented in the past few decades and reverse the damage that has been done by the backlashers. All of us are going to have to be in this effort to try and stop the backlash. But with that, I wanted to thank everyone for coming. Felicity, I'm sure, would thank everyone if she could get unmuted. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but this was such a great presentation. I think that we may use it. So thank you very much. Are you there?
I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. I want to thank everybody and let everybody know that anybody who has anything to say, David or I would be very happy to interview you, whether it be with our group, igdid.com, or however you would like to do it. We would love to hear from anybody. And thank you all for coming.
We are definitely looking for people to interview. We would like to interview therapists, social workers, survivor advocates. Survivors especially. It's our time to actually come forth, and the only way that things are going to be able to change is if we come forward together with a concerted effort and one voice. And Felicity and I are trying to give that voice a means to come out. It doesn't take a lot of money, so we can't afford to pay anybody, but it won't cost you any money either. It'll just cost you a little bit of time. You can get a hold of me at my website, or my email is David Shurter, S-H-U-R-T as in Tom, E-R, with the numeral 1 at gmail.com. So that's davidshurter1 at gmail.com. Felicity, do you want to give your?
It's Felicity, Felicity, the number 4, us, US, the number 2, at gmail.com. So it's felicity4us2 at gmail.com. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Felicity. And hey, thank you everyone for listening.